Mekkah, I've got a riddle for you. What do you get when you have way too many uses of warp and not enough chapters to use them in?
Gee, I don't know. Do you get Chapter 32 and Chapter 32X of Don's Fire Emblem 7 Hector Hard Mode 0% gross playthrough?
God damn it, how did you figure that one out? But as expected, you're exactly correct. Because Chapter 32 Victory or Death is one of those climactic late game maps where the game tries to pull out all the stops against a player. There's a guy here with Berserk, there's a couple of siege tomes, there's a surprising amount of ballista here, which are manned by a copious number of snipers, and most importantly, there are reinforcement zones that trigger promoted enemies to appear. So, out of all these obstacles to deal with, we had to pull out all the stops too, and that means that we can go absolutely wild with our uses of warp and rescue. Unlike in COG Destiny, where the reinforcement zones trigger waves of enemies, the reinforcement zones here immediately trigger enemies to appear. It actually looks kind of funky. Like, you walk into a reinforcement trigger zone, and then all of a sudden, like 5 or 7 enemies appear on the map out of nowhere with no cue whatsoever. And if you're not paying attention, you can actually pretty easily miss them. So in a way, they're kind of like ambush spawns, except that they happen mid-turn instead of at the end of your turn. So they're a little bit more palatable to deal with. Also, unlike in COG Destiny, the objective of this map is to seize rather than to route. So fundamentally, it's much simpler because you just have to get Hector and the boss killer to a certain point instead of trying to kill enemies that are actively refusing to be killed, like Valkyries and Troubadours. But killing the boss in this chapter is still a pretty substantial challenge because the boss is Limstella, she's atop a gate, she's very bulky, and getting Hector safely there through all of the long-range threats is also a bit of a challenge.
So not only is this map very large, but there is also a lot of really harsh terrain. Not just forests and forts, but also lots of mountains and peaks. So to get to the gate, there are several routes that we can take. We can go through the southeast, but then we miss out on an important side objective, and we go basically the longest route with the most enemies and the most terrain for no good reason, so that one's out. That leaves going through the northwest, like going straight up from the starting point and then right. This would let us visit the ruins in the north and recruit Renault easily. However, this way, we would have to fight a bunch of nomad troopers and heroes on the left, and that would slow us down. So what we do instead is we do kind of like a diagonal through the middle of the map. There's a lot of harsh terrain in the way there that we need to circumvent using our transportation staffs and our flyers. Shoutouts to Florina being deployed in Chapter 32, but it also greatly limits the amount of strong enemies that we have to deal with.
One of these strong enemies in this diagonal area is a level 20 hero whom Harkin one round with Brave Sword. This guy has a light brand and a Laponia 0% growth run. He was notable for failing to one round a base Florina who had a pure water boost, but it's precisely because he has 2 range with that light brand that we decided to eliminate him first here. Serra gets a very timely promotion in one of the last maps in the game just to increase her movement, but if you're astute, you might notice after observing this strategy that promoting Serra wasn't necessary. In fact, it could have worked with an unpromoted Serra, but we worked pretty hard to get her level 10, so why not use an Earthsea on her and bear the fruits of our labor? We adopt a formation to prevent Nils from dying on this turn. The Brigand moves first and attacks him from the only accessible space. He could actually one-shot Nils with a Steel Axe, but between his low accuracy and the fact that Nils is pretty okay innate Avoid, which is further boosted by a Tactician bonus, he has a high chance at dodging, and that just leaves Marcus or Heath to survive that Swordmaster, who has a Wodow, and could potentially one round either of them. The Swordmaster decides to attack Marcus even though he has an Iron Rune, and this is because the AI fails to consider crit rates when trying to figure out whom to target. So the Swordmaster ended up targeting Marcus because he had lower defense. Vida murdered a squad of Wyvern Riders with a Brave Lance, but the only one that she couldn't murder was a Wyvern Lord, whom we had placed a mine to get him within chip damage range of a KO. This is the same use of a mine that Laponia did in his playthrough as well. The reason why this works out is because normally for grounded enemies, a mine completely interrupts their movement and triggers the moment they step in that space, but for flying enemies, it doesn't trigger until they complete their action. And because Vida killed all the Wyvern Riders that had moved to that spot, the only enemy that triggered that mine was that Wyvern Lord.
So we have several staff users deployed, but not all of them are created equal. We have Serra and Priscilla, who have A-rank staffs, so they can use both Warp and Rescue, but with a very small range of 5. Then we have Canas and Lucius, who have C-rank staffs, so they use Barrier and Hammerne. Our supreme staff user is of course Pent, who not only has A-rank in staffs, but also 18 magic, so he has a warp range of 9, which is massive. And that's why it might seem off that Pent wasted his turn attacking a Brigand, but that's because warp on this turn used by him doesn't really accomplish anything, so he has nothing better to do before he gets rescued out by Farina, because for our strategy to work, we have to get him past the river, and we do have to move Pent forward a bit so Farina has enough movement to pick him up and still make it there. With regards to our other staff users, 5 range warp and rescue might not seem like it helps much at all, but just like in 3 houses, a small staff range can still be very good. For one, it's enough for Priscilla to rescue Wrath forward, so that he has enough movement to drop Hector on one of the central forts. Wrath is a unique unit in this regard. Our flyers, including Florina, are all too busy with other things, and the only other units that we have who can pick up Hector are Eliwood and our unpromoted Cavaliers, and they have one less movement than Wrath, so they can't make it there. We also need a tiny warp courtesy of Serra to get Heath further north, so that on turn 2 he can kill the Wyvern Lord using his spear, and this also allows him to reach the ruins with Renault on turn 3.
We have to occupy the central forest with Hector and Wrath for 2 reasons. The first, obviously, is to get Hector far enough from the map for the strategy to work, but the second is to stem the tide of monks that we caused to appear by entering a reinforcement zone earlier. These monks are the weakest enemies in this map, and some of the weakest enemies in FE7 in general, because with Hector and Wrath having a full pure water / barrier boost, they take like no damage from them. Only the bishop even poses a mild threat. Vida's going to get pelted by a couple of snipers this turn, and we have to wonder if she's going to be okay because she gets left with exactly 1 HP. This is due to her receiving the Dragon Shield at the beginning of this chapter. It reinforces the idea that units should receive stat boosters to bolster already strong stats because that increased her defense from 22 to 24, and it really helps the survivability for her in this chapter. We also positioned Florina in a way to bait the Berserk Bishop. We made sure that she was lower in the deployment order than Vida, so that on this turn, she gets to face a Berserk hit with a suppressed 10% hit rate, whereas Vida would have faced something like a 41% hit rate.
At this point, we're done setting up, and we want to end the chapter in one swift stroke, with 4 warps, a rescue, and a lot of trade chains. For this turn, we need warp to be in 3 different places, and to facilitate that, we warp Fiora 3 tiles up. Now, warp is at 1 use, so we have to hammer in it with Canas, and once it's repaired, we warp Nils across the river to where Pent is, because Pent needs to take 2 actions this turn. This chapter really reminds me of back when I did individual chapter LTCs of FE6. People are always fixated on who you warp, you know, your Lord and Boss Killer, pretty self-explanatory, but they never ask how you warp, or more precisely, how to get the actual staffs to the places where you need them. In this case, we need to get them up to Pent, so we have Florina take them from Priscilla, and then Fiora can take them and fly her full movement, and that way Pent can take both staffs and use his massive 9 range to rescue Hector. The rescue tile priority in GBA Fire Emblem is the reverse of FE12, which means that the upper tile is the default one that the target ends up on, which is helpful here, because now with Nils' help, Pent can warp Hector into the boss area, putting him in siege range thanks to the boots. Now all this activity that we did triggered the last batch of reinforcements, and all these shamans can definitely get in your way if you let them move around, but the way they are right now, they leave a hole in their formation that Hector can walk through. Once Hector gets there though, he realizes that there's one small problem. The boss is still alive and Vida's not in range to fight her, despite the fact that we already catapulted her far ahead with a warp and a rescue on turn 1, but no worries. We can have Florina bring over the warp staff to Vida, and then have our new recruit Renault warp Vida in range of Limstella. Limstella is a ridiculously bulky boss with capped defense and about 70 HP. This is the fight that we needed Vida to reach S-rank lances for, as she needs to crit 2 times out of 4 with the Brave Lance, and a 5% boost to her critical rate adds a nice amount of reliability there. So that's chapter 32, completed in 3 turns. Let's move on to chapter 32X.
Chapter 32X concludes Kashuna's character arc in FE7, and much like the preceding Kashuna maps, this chapter features some, well, interesting map concepts. In contrast to chapter 32, where we maneuvered about with a barrage of well-placed rescue and warp, Chapter 32X is as basic as a warp shift can get. You don't even have to warp a lord. And the idea behind this chapter, played straight, is that you're supposed to walk around in a spiral, cutting a path through all these enemy berserkers that have surprisingly high hit rates and can crit you, before unlocking the door to Kashuna's room and putting him down for good. The purpose of his magic seal is to prevent you from sniping him in the long-range tome, but there are still parts of the map that aren't covered by the magic seal, and there's nothing stopping you from just warping in someone to kill Kashuna on the spot. Now, the game tries to do something about this by causing a throng of berserkers to appear the moment that Kashuna's room is breached, but none of them actually stand directly in front of Kashuna, so Jafar is free to just walk up slowly and one-shot him with the Phyllis Might Boost Killing Edge crit, thereby finishing chapter 32X in 1 turn. Come back next time for the grand finale.
See ya.